This is Mr. Cruz. This is lesson number 2, video number 3. And this should be the last video of lesson 2. In video number 2, we just ended a 5-minute biography on Adolf Hitler. Hitler does commit suicide in Berlin in 1945. Who overran Berlin? The Soviet Union invaded Berlin, the capital of Germany. And that signified the end of the European theater. Keep in mind, that is not the end of the war. Okay, the United States is still at war with who? That's right, Japan. So which brings us into our next individual. Hirohito. He is the Emperor of Japan. Okay, he's part of the Axis during World War II. Now you may have heard, or maybe your teacher has told you about a guy named Tojo. Say, hey man, I thought Tojo was in charge here. Actually, the Emperor is Hirohito. We'll talk about Tojo later. He's a major player in Japan during the war. But the Emperor is Hirohito. I'm going to watch a 5-minute video on Hirohito, and we'll talk about Tojo in future lessons.
Emperor Hirohito was the 124th Emperor of Japan, reigning from 1926 until 1989. Hirohito was born in Tokyo in 1901 and was the eldest son of the Crown Prince Yoshihito. When Yoshihito's father died when Hirohito was just 11, Yoshihito became Emperor Taisho, and Hirohito was named the heir apparent. Hirohito attended school and then attended a special institute for the Crown Prince until 1921, when he embarked on a 6-month tour of Europe, becoming the first member of the Japanese imperial family to travel abroad. Hirohito married Princess Nagako in 1924 and was made emperor in 1926 when his father died. Hirohito ascended to power during a difficult time in Japan. A financial crisis was deeply affecting the country. Hirohito's influence and power grew after Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated in 1936, and an attempted military coup was crushed under Hirohito's orders. Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeast China, in 1931, and then invaded parts of China in 1937. In 1940, under Hirohito's leadership, Japan formed the Axis powers under the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and prepared for war with the United States and Great Britain if diplomacy failed. Hirohito was an advocate for a peaceful resolution to the disagreements with the West, but slowly began to favor war, and chose hardline General Hideki Tojo to provide a policy review of recent conferences. Tojo, along with the chiefs of staff of the Navy and the Army, convinced Hirohito to opt for war, and eventually the Emperor gave the order for the execution of the simultaneous attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, as well as the invasion of Malaysia in 1941. Hirohito was initially pleased by Japan's early victories, but by the spring of 1945 the defeat of Japan seemed imminent. Hirohito had sent out orders to all Japanese civilians commanding them to commit suicide rather than surrender, leading to the suicide of over 10,000 civilians as the Allied forces continued to advance. Following the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hirohito insisted that Japan surrender. He made a radio broadcast in August 1945 announcing the end of the war. Following the war, much criticism was directed towards Hirohito for the atrocities carried out by the imperial forces in World War II, and many wanted him tried as a war criminal. The decision was made to exonerate all members of the imperial family under the direction of US General Douglas MacArthur. He spent his post-war years traveling throughout Japan, observing the progress of the reconstruction of the country, and slowly gaining popularity for the imperial family, as well as traveling abroad to meet with various foreign leaders to rebuild Japan's diplomatic image. In 1988, he collapsed in his palace and died on January 7th, 1989.
Okay, that was Emperor Hirohito. Okay, that was Emperor Hirohito of Japan on the Axis. Our next individual, we're going to switch to the Allies. One of my favorites, Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. Winston Churchill, an intellectual, but he could relate to the common person, much like FDR. He could rally the people of Great Britain, much like FDR. He created a personable relationship with the people of Great Britain, much like FDR did with his fireside chats. So they had a lot in common. There was a reason they got along so well. What makes Churchill one of my favorite people to study and to read about is what a diverse individual he was, politically, professionally, personally. Very diverse guy. They say, history is more interesting if you can study these individuals and see their human element. Many times, humor, anecdotal stories can serve as an anticipatory set in the high school or undergrad environment. A hook to get you a little more interested, to show that these guys had a pulse. These people were like you. They made mistakes. They did goofy things. It wasn't just it's not just facts and dates. So one story about Churchill I like that you won't read in your textbook. He's showing up for a dinner, and it's high society, aristocratic, British, formal event, and Mr. Churchill, he shows up. How you say? Hammered. He's hammered. We'll go with hammered. And he shows up at the dinner, and one of the, now I'm paraphrasing this story. I forgot what biography I read this in, but I'm paraphrasing. He shows up hammered, and this British debutante turns to Churchill and says, "My good man, you are drunk." Churchill turns to the woman and says, "My good woman, you are ugly. However, in the morning, I shall be sober." That's one of my favorite Churchill stories. But besides the anecdotal stories, besides all the great things he did that you'll read about in your textbook or a good Churchill biography, he's also one of the most quotable people of the 20th century. You'll see his quotes all over. A lot of times you see him on your little book face there on the interweb. But when you see some of his quotes, kind of verifying, there are quotes floating around the interweb that aren't really Winston Churchill. But nonetheless, very quotable guy. You could just take his quotes and write a paper on that. So without further ado, one of my favorite people, we're going to see a 5-minute video on Sir Winston Churchill.
Hero. He was a historian, he was a journalist. He combined incredible decision-making, very clear decision-making, with amazing rhetorical skills.
Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born into a wealthy family on November 30th, 1874, in Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, England.
He went off to war very early, first as a correspondent and then as a combatant. He had this dramatic escape from prison camp in the Boer Wars in South Africa. That was printed, and he became a kind of national figure at a very early age.
Just before World War I, in 1911, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. In 1915, he resigned his position in the government and went to France to fight on the front lines until his unit was disbanded in 1916.
After World War I, he was out of favor with the British. He'd made a decision about Gallipoli, about going ashore there and having that invasion, trying to cut off the Turks. It turned out to be a disaster. So he retreated to his country estate, wrote, lectured, stayed attuned to what was going on.
He was something of a maverick politician, and not everyone got along with Winston. It took the 1930s, with the international circumstances of the rise of Nazi Germany, that made people consider Winston Churchill a potential national leader.
When World War II began to rise out of the darkness of Nazi Germany and Great Britain knew that it was imperiled, there were lots of Tories who said that Churchill needs to be brought back into government.
Churchill returned as First Lord of the Admiralty the day Britain declared war on Germany, September 3rd, 1939. Less than a year later, he became Prime Minister.
Churchill brought a great clarity of thinking of the reality of the threat that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany meant, not just to that island nation, but to the world. He also brought an ability to mobilize the English language as a fighting force. In his speeches, in his radio interviews, in his reports to the nation, he gave them hope.
In the summer of 1940, Hitler launched what Churchill termed the Battle of Britain. At the time, it was the largest sustained aerial bombing campaign in history. In London alone, more than 1 million houses were destroyed, and more than 20,000 civilians were killed.
Churchill offered full support for the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the USSR. He famously said, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons."
The story is that when he got the word that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, he was joyful, not because the United States had been attacked, but because he knew that the United States would have no choice but to get into the war, and now it could be won.
On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. More than 300,000 British soldiers and 60,000 civilians died during the war. In July 1945, Churchill lost the prime ministership, but remained a force in government.
In 1951, he was again elected prime minister under the impression of a potential expansionist Soviet Union, and people felt that Winston Churchill was the right person to stand up against tyranny.
In 1953, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature and knighted. He served as prime minister until 1955, and afterwards continued to serve in the House of Commons until 1964.
On January 24, 1965, when Churchill died, the state burial was one of the greatest meetings of political leaders of the 20th century.
I think Churchill will be a great man down through the ages. And you could not have had a better ally in every sense of the phrase. He gave voice to the common hope of free people. I think he's one of the great men, not just of our time, but of all time.
That was Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Next, what most historians consider the second greatest president of all time, and of course that can be debated. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, your 32nd president. FDR comes in at a good time. They say in Great Britain, Churchill was the perfect man for that time, because the second the war is over, they get rid of him. They say Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the perfect man for this time, for World War II. And, for many reasons, as you can see there, as you'll see in a video coming up. One of the things, whether, the controversial New Deal or his handling of the Pearl Harbor attacks or the European theater, FDR, like Churchill, could connect to the American people. He's stricken with polio as an adult, and while he's trying to, try different types of rehabilitation for his legs, he meets, common middle-class rural Americans. And he came from a privileged background, and he gets a real, a sincere sense of closeness to the American people. He has conversations with the average person. And some historians will argue, if not for his polio, he wouldn't have had such good rapport with the American people in his fireside chats, which were radio addresses. And people felt, because of his fireside chats, that I know him, like he knows me, he's talking to my family, or he's like a member of the family, and I trust him. He had the trust of the American people in some very hard times. Again, it's extremely debatable exactly how much his New Deal affected the Great Depression. I believe the majority of historians would tell you World War II gets us out of the Great Depression, ironically, more so than the New Deal, but we're not going to have that debate now. But he is able to connect to the American people, unlike many presidents that we've had before his time, and after, for that matter. But you're going to see a short video here on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president of the United States. And in the interest of time, we're coming up on 15 minutes for this section. We'll start the Franklin Delano Roosevelt biography in the next video.